Hello and welcome to the Facing Up podcast with me, Luke Grenfell-Shaw. This week, I am joined by Emma Skye, who is someone I never thought I would have the opportunity to talk to. I picked up her book, I don't know how many years ago in Waterstones, and I was like, God, this looks like a really interesting book. It's about this person who's worked out in Iraq, seemed to have some great insight into it. And at this time, I was studying Arabic, and I thought, wow, this is a really interesting book. I'm going to go and check it out. Here I am about 5 years later talking to Emma Skye. And so this is a very exciting moment for me. So I hope everyone who's listening will indulge my enthusiasm and excitement throughout this next hour. A bit of a background to Emma. Emma studied Hebrew and Arabic at Oxford, partly inspired by the first Intifada in Palestine, which diverted her from the classics into something perhaps at the cutting edge of current. She then went on to work for the British Council out in Jerusalem, was involved in the peace process between Israel and Palestine. And as you can guess, the next logical step was to become the governor of a province in Iraq. The next logical step after that was to become the political advisor to the top general, American general in Iraq. And she has then, well, since that and continuing, has gone on to lead a very varied career, very much an itinerant globetrotter. I think we're going to get into a few more details and exactly how you went on this journey very shortly. But Emma, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the Facing Up podcast.
Luke, thank you very much for inviting me on. And none of what you just read out, none of that was planned. So all people who are like, in their 20s thinking everything is planned from the time you graduate through to the time you retire, it's not true.
I think that's a really interesting point there because, so much of my life is now, in the last couple of years, has not been planned, and it just following your nose just leads you in sort of many more interesting directions than you'd expect. If you'd had your life planned out and were rigidly following it.
No, it's absolutely true. I think opportunities come along in life, and it's whether you take them or not. Sometimes things happen to you that completely come out of the blue, and it's how you respond to them. So with all of these things, yes, there are things outside your control, but how you respond to the events is within your control.
Absolutely. That's completely my attitude as well, that there are some things that come along and it feels like the world has ended for you or for your family, but you've still got to sort of work out what can I do in this situation? I'm still living. If I just decide to give up, well, I'm the one who's losing out. So how can I move forward from this? So, Emma, you were working for the British Council, and in 2003, the invasion of Iraq took place.
How old were you, Luke, in 2003?
Mental maths off the top of my head. 9 years old. It was weird. I was thinking about this. It was very much, I barely knew what was happening. I remember, playing out in the field at school, and one of the older boys was like, peace, peace, with like the V sign. And I didn't really get what any of that was about. It was only a very vague comprehension of the war, what Iraq was, what it was all about. What was a weapon of mass destruction? I had no idea. How did you see it? Just briefly, how that time?
Well, I was somebody who was very much anti-war. My whole sort of being was very anti-war. I'd spent years, as you mentioned, in Jerusalem, working with Israelis and Palestinians. And during the first Gulf War, I was a student at Oxford. And, I was on every anti-war demonstration. I signed up to be a human shield. So being somebody who very, actively protested wars and went out to difficult places to try and help broker peace, that was very much in my DNA. And so in the build up to the 2003 war, I was very anti-war. But when the decision was taken that we were going to war, and afterwards when the British government said, hey, we need people to run Iraq, I volunteered. I thought I could go out there, apologize to Iraqis for the war, and use all the skills I'd developed from working in Israel, Palestine, to help them rebuild their country.
And presumably that goes well beyond, being, fluent in Arabic.
Well, none of these things, when they asked for volunteers, they didn't actually look for people's skill sets.
Oh, that's
so it was kind of
depressing.
You'd like to feel that they had all these jobs outlined and then you applied for a job and they matched. No. When I volunteered to go, I was just, one of, I don't know how many volunteered to go. I can't remember how many it was, but it was in the dozens. It wasn't in the hundreds. And I didn't know what my job was going to be before I went out.
Right. So we have Emma Skye, who is, passionately anti-war, pro-peace, going out to Iraq, not knowing what the job is, and you end up in Kirkuk province in northeastern Iraq on the border with Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and you became the governor coordinator, right? How on earth do you get going on a job like that? This must have been so far out of your comfort zone. How do you deal with that kind of challenge?
Yes, you're suddenly told that you're like the equivalent of being a mayor of a town or a governor of a province. I'd never been a mayor of a town in the UK, let alone the governor of a province in someone else's country. So this whole thing of like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. It's so beyond my skill set. And you start coming up with all of this, but at the end of the day, who else was going to do it?
Any Iraqis?
Well, we had to find the Iraqis to put them in place. So that, initially when we went in, we dismissed those incumbents.
Yeah, and the associated with the Ba'ath Party.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was de-Baathification. There was, a lot of people who were involved in the former regime ran away. Others we dismissed from their jobs. And there was supposed to be, we were told, a 3-month period where we administered the country before we handed it back to the Iraqis. So that was the plan. The role was to get Iraqi institutions up and functioning post-war. And, when I arrived in Kirkuk, I was, there were very, very few civilians there. There was a US military brigade, and the military was doing everything. And of course, they weren't told what to do. They were just getting on and doing it. And I was so aware of all the things they were doing wrong, and I kept criticizing them. And the brigade commander said, look, instead of criticizing us all the time, why don't you actually work with us and try and help us do the right thing?
Right.
So that kind of like, oh, that's really crossing a line.
Oh.
But I think it's effective. I'd never worked with militaries before. Civilians aren't supposed to work with militaries.
Was that also crossing a moral line?
It was crossing what I, at that time, thought of as probably a moral line. It was always this sense, we shouldn't be at war. This war is not a legal war. So the whole, the first time actually going to Iraq, to go into a country which we had invaded in a way that I didn't regard as legal, to then be put in a situation as occupier, I didn't realize I was going to be an occupier. Then, the reason I started working with the military was because in my first week in Kirkuk, insurgents came to my house and blew it up with me in it. So then it became a sense of, look, if I'm just staying to do this job, I have to be able to function. And I can't live in my house because my house no longer exists. I was very fortunate. So I moved on to the airfield.
Right. So you're fortunate not to be killed in that ambush on your house, or the attack on your house.
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate. A few weeks after that attack was the attack on UN headquarters in Baghdad and the killing of Sergio de Mello. And, there were a number of assassination attempts going on. So I was very, very fortunate. And so I moved onto the airfield and, I lived in a tent for a while on an airfield. And the airfield was controlled by the US military. So I came into contact with the military because I needed somewhere to live. And from then on, it wasn't for the insurgents, they didn't differentiate between, hello, here is a British civilian and these are US military.
Right.
We were all foreigners. We were all seen as part of the US project. So everybody was a target in a way.
It sounds fascinating that my reading of this is before you could start cooperating and working with the Iraqis, you actually had to start cooperating and working with the Americans, which I imagine is not the order of the way of doing things you would have liked.
Yes, I realized that, when you think of who's the power in the province, the power of the guys in uniform, because not only did they have guns, they had money and they had organization. So I was there supposedly given this big title with minimum organization. I had very few people working for me. People had just come from, different places. There was no organization as such. We had to build that. And the resources, mine were far less than the military's. So by creating a joint team, by working together, it meant that I could use the organization of the military, could use the resources of the military and the people. They had many talented people in their organization, as I found out. I mean, who knew that people in the military would have master's degrees from Harvard and places like that? It was like, this was all a bit of a shock to me.
Brains as well as brawn. What is this?
Yeah, why is that needed?
Can they still shoot straight? You make it sound very well thought through that, here I am, governor, coordinator, don't have that many resources myself, so I'll partner with the US military and we'll get things done. That sounds great, but can you just take me back to the first day you got to whatever your office was and just how you felt about the challenges and uncertainties ahead? Because there must, how do you even make a start in that situation?
Well, how do you even know what your office is supposed to be? So they had it was the Kirkuk government building. So that was the headquarters of local government, where the governor sat, where the members of the provincial council, all of that. But of course, there weren't any at the time. So when I moved into the building, every room in that building had been taken over by US military. So different units, one thing would say paratroopers, or 173rd civil affairs, or tankers, or whatever. Every unit had got its own motto and whatever, had them on the doors. So even to find an office was hard enough because everything had been taken over. When I went to see the brigade commander to basically introduce myself and to say, could I find some accommodation on the airfield because my house has just been blown up? He was the one who said, we're going to work together. We're going to share an office. And he'd already taken over the governor's office, which was this really large office. Very nice-ish.
I'm trying to resist making any sorts of comments about, brigade commanders taking over the largest room in the building, but
it's kind of, the top guy gets the biggest room.
Yeah.
They were already starting to repair and do all the works on the building because everywhere it was run down and damaged and looted. So they were already working on repairing it. And he said, we're going to share an office. In Baghdad, it was Ambassador Bremer and General Sanchez. In Kirkuk, it was to be Colonel Mabel and Emma Sky. And the motto of their unit was Sky Soldiers. So everywhere we went, soldiers would jump up and say, Sky Soldiers. And I had no idea. I never heard of units having mottos. And I thought, this is really embarrassing. Everywhere I go, my surname is Sky and people are jumping up and saying Sky Soldiers. It was all rather weird.
So relatively soon on, you started working with the American troops there. But how did you actually start identifying what work needed to be done, reaching out to Iraqis? Like who are the influential Iraqis? Who are the people who are respected? I still don't have a kind of flavor of like, I'm just trying to put myself in your situation, which would be just terrible in so many ways. But I'm just like, how would I even start trying to, what's the 101 of rebuild a province or a state apparatus or trust?
And well, the first thing you do is get to know the people in the province. And Kirkuk is a very, it's about 1.5 million people. And it was a province that is highly contested. So under Saddam, through the Ba'ath Party, they wanted to keep control of Kirkuk because it has oil fields, and about 40% of Iraq's oil comes from Kirkuk. And so in this province, Saddam pushed out people who were Kurdish and Turkmen and brought in Arabs from the south who were Shia. And in the aftermath, it was called Arabization. In the aftermath of 2003, Kurds and Turkmen were coming back and they were kicking out Arabs. Now, mostly Arabs who were seen as the new Arabs, 10,000 dinar families, people who had, come up for a small amount of money, but also some of the Arabs who were indigenous to the province. So we had massive population displacement. And so coming into this situation, I had just been attacked, so I needed to find out who was attacking us and why, to really understand the environment and to understand the grievances of different groups. Everybody there had a grievance. Some were fearful of the past, some were fearful of the future. And it was very, very complex. And of course, coming in as an outsider to try and understand what was going on was really, really complicated. So who were the representatives of which groups? You had new political parties. So the Kurds were quite well organized because they'd had years with their area in the north where they had two main parties, the PUK, KDP, and they had all party machinery. They were organized. Some parts of the Turkmens were politically organized. The Arabs weren't organized at all. They had a Ba'ath Party, and the Ba'ath Party was dissolved, and there was no other political organization. So you had tribal structures. And then there were plenty of people who didn't relate to any of these political parties or these leaders or anybody. So it would be layer after layer of meeting with different groups, trying to understand their concerns, trying to mediate between different groups. So I really spent a lot of my time mediating, like day in, day out, helping people understand what was happening. And of course, people thought this is America. America put a man on the moon. In 6 months' time, we're going to have a fully developed country.
New democracy, all the bells and whistles.
Yes, they thought they were going to be like Dubai in 6 months. And so they were sitting there, people were waiting for all of these things to happen. And because they didn't happen.
So the Iraqis thought that their country would be developed at breakneck speed, a la Dubai.
Yeah, I thought it would be turned into Dubai in 6 months by the Americans.
I thought you were saying that it was the American troops who were like, yeah, we're gonna, just you wait. There's gonna be, a new, Burj Al Arab or whatever, sort of all sorts of skyscrapers built, but
no, it was Iraqi.
The Iraqis. And
we overpromised and under-delivered all the time. And so that led to all these conspiracy theories that, we were taking their oil. They didn't have electricity because we were stealing their oil.
Mm.
You think, well, there's no electricity because every time we try and restore the line, an insurgent comes along and blows it up. Mm. So, and the same people who would come to us to get paid a contract to guard the pipeline, parts of their tribe would also be blowing it up. So they were getting like double payment all the time. And so, there you are as an ignorant foreigner. And it seems to be that lots of people in the province knew what was going on. But how do we understand what is going on? So very complex.
Yes. And I know that we've really only scratched the surface there. Before we move on, I was just wondering to the extent, and I guess this might be a question that goes for all of your time in Iraq, but perhaps particularly when you were governing, as you said, like the mayor of this country, being the mayor of Bristol, would be enough of a task, but let alone
Marvin Rees, good man.
Yeah, Marvin Rees, yes. And I was wondering to what extent you felt like you had maybe a bit of an identity struggle of being kind of a part of this new colonialism. being this person who's very out of place, doesn't really understand what's going on, though you would understand it so much better than a lot of people. And yet you were the person who is sort of helping to guide this province and making key decisions. Was that quite uncomfortable?
When you're there, you are just working so hard from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. And there isn't really much time to stand back and see things in this bigger frame. Every day we were just trying to prevent civil war from happening. That was the main fundamental struggle. The idea, I was working for the British Council at the time. I was on secondment. And they said, your 3 months is up. It's time for you to come home. I said, I can't come home. I've got this rather large job and there's no one to replace me. And they're like, don't be stupid, come home. And you think, in a situation like Kirkuk, they needed someone to mediate. And I was playing that mediator role. So I wasn't thinking all the time, oh, isn't it terrible that I'm here? I was thinking, I'm trying to do my best to prevent the fabric of society completely breaking down.
Right. So in a way, having this time to sort of analyze and potentially overanalyze the sort of meaning of what one's doing and whether it's good or bad, that's a luxury.
I think that comes later when you stand back and reflect. But for many of us who worked in Iraq became an absolute passion. That, lots of us cared deeply, deeply about this country and its future. That feel, I feel I have a stake in its future, want to help, want to make it better. And yes, that's a very deep relationship.
Yes. And so you fast forward a few years, you did eventually go back to the UK about a year later, but by 2007, you were back out in Iraq as the political advisor to General Odinero, who was the top general, US general in Iraq. How did that come about, to start with? That's quite a sort of jump up again, it seems. You're sort of doing this, I don't know, amazing vaulting up the side of a mountain or something.
Well, there weren't many people who wanted to go and work in places like Iraq. So you can get these field promotions as such. But General Odierno, back in 2003, had also been the general responsible for the area of Iraq that I was in. So he came regularly to Kirkuk, and I'd met him numerous times there. And, we got on very, very well. So when he was appointed to be the operational commander for the surge, he sent me this email and said, please, will you come and be my political advisor? And I thought, the first time I'd gone out to Iraq was to apologize to Iraqis for the war. Second time I'm going because this American general has asked me to, and he was an American general with a mixed reputation. I liked him a lot. I had huge respect for him, but he was seen as somebody who was very tough and at one end of the spectrum of the use of force. And when I got out,
quite the far end of the spectrum, we're very willing to use force, and that goes with the surge, which was this big influx of American troops trying to restore order, right, in 2007.
The surge was to do things in a different manner. And for him, when I arrived, I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, back in 2003, I had nobody to tell me when I was screwing up. I had nobody who I could, have those talks with in the evenings. I didn't have a confidant. And he said, I want you to come with me wherever I go, whether it's the front line of battle or meeting with the president. And I want you to, prepare me for these meetings, debrief me, and tell me when I'm making mistakes. And I think just by saying that says a lot about him. Because people always say to you, as a leader, you should have people around you who are different from you. And people don't. They have people who are like them, people who think the same as them. But Odierno and I think completely differently. We're completely different backgrounds. If it hadn't been for the Iraq War, our paths would never have crossed. we've not read the same books. We don't like the same things. There is no point of, he's massive. He's like 6'5", American football player. He's huge.
Right.
Shaven hair. I mean, he looks very scary.
Yeah.
But
And
he is
for people who can't see, Emma, you're not a giant yourself.
No, I'm not a giant. Average
quite
height
petite.
for Europe. But he was somebody, we had a very good banter. I could tell him in a funny, humorous way when people weren't around. I wouldn't embarrass him in front of others. But he really wanted me to say my opinion and gave me that opportunity to say that.
I think honest feedback delivered because you care about the other person is one of the most valuable gifts that we can receive for our own personal development.
And he, in between, his son was in the army. And in between 2003 and 2007, his son had served in Iraq and had been badly wounded in an attack, got his arm blown off, and his driver was killed. So this war is a war that is personal. And for someone like General Obieno, who until Iraq believed that, the US military could achieve anything in the world, greatest military the world has ever seen. And then comes up against Iraq.
Right.
And what do you do when the greatest military in the world can't solve this problem? And so he realized that needed to do things differently, needed a different skill set, a skill set that they didn't have. And he believed that I could help him. So I thought, he's a guy I trust, he's a guy I respect. If he thinks I can help him, then that will be my role, is trying to help him be the best that he can be.
Yeah.
With 170,000 troops in country. Iraq at that time was in civil war. It was in a disastrous state. Hundreds of thousands had been killed. And every day, every morning, you would find dead bodies in the streets of Baghdad. And you could tell whether they were Sunni or Shia, depending whether they'd been shot through the head or drilled through the head.
Yeah. It's not a very, very tough environment to be in. I'm really interested, there's so much that we could talk about, and I know you've talked about, a lot of the details of the surge before, but I want to ask a different question of how it was to be, this is a very male dominated environment. This is the military. It's a very macho environment. You've got, people like Obieno, who are, as you said, 6'5". There's so much, talk and conversation, discourse today about, the difficulties in many different ways, for both men and women in various forms of sexism, just in the office. And yet this seems to be an environment that would perhaps be magnifying any sorts of, differences. How was it? How was that factor? How was that environment to be a relatively isolated woman?
It is a very male environment. And I think the US military has done a lot to try and create an inclusive environment. So when you're fighting, you've got to rely on the person on the left and the person on the right. So people are in the room because they bring something. And I was seen as somebody who had something useful to contribute. If I didn't have anything useful to contribute, then I'd be quickly marginalized. And the general made it known that I was important to him, that I was to be in his inner circle. So wherever we went, there was a seat for me besides him. And, I can think of many times in organizations, you've got to really struggle to get your seat. With them, I never had to struggle to get my seat. My seat was there. What I did with my seat was, I had to be the best that I could be. I put in huge amounts of work in order to be an effective advisor. But he was the one who gave me the opportunity and the platform to play that role. Interestingly enough, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, his primary advisor was a woman, Dr. Bassema. And,
Realise
Dr.
that.
Dr. Bassam and I would spend hours together, going like these military men, they're so this, they're so that.
Right.
We had many things in common, but she had that role. She was a rocket scientist, a PhD in rocket science. She was
Wow.
really efficient. She really got things done. So you saw in these meetings, it'd be like these two men, and behind them or to the side of them would be these two women.
Where the real conversation happened.
Well, we were always, trying to prepare our respective principals for those meetings. And when the meetings went well, we would look at each other and kind of wink. We had got them to agreement. And that sense, people don't just go into, when you see those meetings and negotiations, when principals go into a room, there are advisors behind who've been doing all the legwork to find where the deal is possible, to prepare their principals.
It sounds really interesting because it sounds like you and Dr. Bassama, it seems like you both saw eye to eye way before Odiana and Maliki saw eye to eye. It seemed like you two were on the common wavelength, and then you just had to get your two, as you said, respective principles to kind of also share the common wavelength that you were already on.
But it took a long time. That doesn't just happen. We had to get to know each other. So Bassama really distrusted the US military. The military was horrible about her. They would leak things in the media. They were constantly, she's a really difficult person. And there's a reason that she's a difficult person. If you were treated like that all the time, you'd be a difficult person. So it took us a while to build up that trust. She wanted to, of course, she thought all these conspiracy theories about America, and to go through to try and convince her that what had gone wrong in Iraq was due to incompetence, not conspiracy. And hours and hours and hours. She wanted this explanation, that explanation. So it took a long time to build up the trust. You need trust to have a working relationship. Unless you've got that trust, how can you ever reach an agreement? In the US military, in military intelligence, there were very strong women in military intelligence. And I worked very closely with them. And we understood, the military tends to view things in terms of enemy and friends. So the enemy in Iraq, all these people who were fighting, were just called the enemy. And to try and work out who are these people, why are they fighting, and what do they want?
Sounds like Star Wars, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we worked very, very closely with this other group of women to try and work out who these different groups were, and to stop calling them the enemy, call them by their names, and find out what it is they wanted. Could we do a deal? So this change, getting the military to change its mindset, the whole thing of the surge was not really about the extra numbers, it was about doing things differently.
Right.
So it wasn't, this idea of trying to work out who's fighting and why, trying to do deals, trying to get people to give up using force and come into the political process. Getting the Iraqi prime minister to see that we weren't bringing back the Ba'ath Party to overthrow him. There's a lot of work going on in this.
Yes. And to return to the point of gender in a sense, it sounded like that wasn't a big factor for you in terms of how your ability to, in terms of the environment that you're operating in. And I'll leave that question there.
Well, I grew up in a very male-dominated environment. So in the world that I moved in and lived in, my whole life has been very heavily male-dominated. And so when you get involved in security, you're moving into a field where there aren't so many women. I can see many women coming up behind me now, many women getting involved in this. But also growing up in a time where you didn't think in terms so much of identity, where now everybody is very focused on their identity. At that time, just got on and did it and tried to push through and tried to get there. But I wouldn't look around and think, oh, I'm the only woman in the room. I've been the only woman in classrooms. I've been the only woman in, in many, many different settings. So it's not something I think, oh, I'm the only woman.
Right. What do you
It's a
think then
norm.
about this? We're much more conscious of our identity. Is that a positive thing, or does that actually detract from getting the job done, for instance?
You know, you want everybody to be able to develop to their full potential, to contribute to their full potential. Because if everybody's developing to their full potential, contributing to their full potential, our society flourishes. And I think that's really positive. The negative will be, I'm not developing because you are stopping me. And then we're not leveling up, we're all leveling down.
Yeah.
And I see things much more in terms of power than in terms of gender or race. It's who has power and what they do with that power. So it's really important that people are aware of the obstacles that prevent people from developing to their full potential, and to work at removing those obstacles to allow everyone to develop to their full potential. You want society as a whole to go forward, and not for us all to turn on each other and bring each other down.
It sounds like you look at this more holistically in sort of rather than categorizing all the different ways that someone might be discriminated against or have additional challenges thrown at them. You're just sort of thinking, well, if there are challenges, regardless of what they are, how can we remove them? Not regardless of what they are, but regardless of why they're there, if they're to do with gender or something else, or race or ethnicity. It's more of a, whatever the challenge is, we need to help people or work out how people can realize their potential.
Yeah, and sometimes there are these really strong structural barriers. So how do you remove them? From my experience in Iraq, when we got to Iraq, we decided we want to create this pluralistic society. And then we thought of Iraq as Sunni, Shia, Kurd, as if these were three homogenous groups, as if that's the only part of somebody's identity.
Yeah.
And what we did, we broke down a state. We thought of people in those terms. The whole electoral system became, if you're Sunni, you vote for Sunni, Shia for Shia, Kurd for Kurd, and the country descended into civil war. So
do you think that became a self-fulfilling prophecy because America and the UK defined as Sunni, Shia, Kurd? It then translated that people, perhaps more than they would have done otherwise, voted along the lines of, oh, I'm a Shia, I will vote for the Shia candidate.
There were no other political parties. The political parties were then based on that.
So the political parties were formed kind of with the America saying, we need a Shia political party, we need a Sunni political party. Is that how it happened?
All the incentive structures were set that way. Some of the political parties have been there for years, but the incentive structures were set that way. And so that is what happened. And this is what becomes dangerous. When you live together in a country, you have all those things in common. And you want a state that emphasizes the commonalities, and not that says that job is for Sunni, that job for a Shia, that job for a Kurd. And this was part of the reason, the collapse of the state, the institutionalization of sect and ethnicity created the civil war. So these people who have lived together for centuries upon centuries upon centuries were then killing each other. So that is identity politics taken to an extreme. The challenge is, we live in shared spaces. We live in society. How do you create that state structure that has institutions that can mediate conflict, that allows everybody to have opportunities and to develop to their full potential? That's a challenge for every country.
Yes.
But we didn't emphasize the Iraqiness, we emphasized sub-identities.
Yes, and because it was so crude, the incredible complexity of each person's identity was reduced to one point.
Just one point where, there is no single narrative. We're all complex people. We've all got complex identities. And in different environments, different aspects of your identity become the major part of your identity.
Yes. Yeah. to move on, you came back in 2010 from this time in Iraq where you were, working incredibly hard for something that you seem incredibly passionate about and you found incredibly meaningful. And you return on, I read this, to no one, to no fanfare, to no trumpets, no one even knew you were coming back to your flat in London, and your house in London. And well, how did you deal with the loss? That loss of meaning and purpose and identity. It seems like you do, at least now, recognize identity, even if it wasn't something as you were growing up. Like, identity does seem important. How did you deal with all this?
Well, my identity was very much wrapped around my job. So I had spent, the best part between, 2003 to 2010, I'd been away at war. So whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or back in Jerusalem, and, working on behalf of the British government, to then come back in 2010 and, I didn't have a job. I'd had to leave my work in the British Council and go on contract. And so when I came back, I had no job. There was nobody who wanted to hear about the experiences. There was no one to debrief me. I was the longest serving Brit in Iraq. I'd worked at all of these levels. I was very integrated within the US system, and nobody in the UK wanted to know or wanted to hear about it. And, there's no one to say like, hey, thank you for trying so hard. There was no one to say anything. So the first time I actually got to talk about it was when I was asked to testify before the Iraq inquiry.
Goodness. That must have been difficult as well to have, must be incredibly difficult to have no recognition. I think I'm very fortunate, say, with the Bristol to Beijing cycle ride, that so many people have been incredibly supportive, and that's made me feel great. I'm like, right, this is something that's really worth doing. Everyone's telling me that this is, very impactful, and that's amazing to hear. But when you don't hear that, and yet it's something that you spent best part of a decade on and off, in that area of the world. I mean, that's Iraq, Afghanistan, Jerusalem. But you put so much time and effort into that.
The Iraq War is hugely unpopular, and people just wanted to draw a line on it and just let's move swiftly on. And the Brits had really pulled out, I think, by the end of 2007, 2008, there really weren't any Brits left working there. So I had continued within the US system, continuing to work on something I felt very important. And I think for anybody, when they've been involved in such things, when they come home, it's always going to be difficult. But normally you will have an institution that you go back to, and normally you'll get debriefed, that somebody will sit you down and say, tell me what you learned, how was it, what should we take away from this? And to not have that happen when I got back, to just, to come back to absolutely nothing. I had no job, I had no income, I had no purpose, I had nothing. So it's like, so what happens the rest of my life?
Yeah. So how did you move forward?
There was a really good friend of mine who's a professor at Harvard, Megan O'Sullivan, who told me about these fellowships they have at Harvard, where you come for one semester to the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School to be an interesting person about campus and to inspire young people to go into public service.
Sounds great.
So I put in an application, and it's the students themselves who choose who the fellows are.
Oh, wow. Ooh.
So they select 6 fellows a semester, 2 semesters. So they select 6 fellows, and sometimes one of them is an international. So I put in my application, and I think in December I was interviewed, sitting where I'm sitting now, interviewed by these Harvard students about why I wanted to come and what I would talk about while I was there. And I said, I'm going to talk about our post 9/11 wars. Was it for national security or was it imperial hubris? And I want to create a space where we can have a debate about that. What were we doing? Have we made the world safe, or have we created more enemies? And I'm going to have great conversations with generals in the front line through to people working in civil society. That's what I'm going to do. And they said, hey, that sounds really cool. So it's a bit of a scary interview, being interviewed by people who are like 18, 19, 20.
Yeah, right. Shoe on the other foot, certainly from where you are now.
But I got to go to Harvard for a semester. And that was wonderful, because there I was surrounded by all of these students who wanted to hear all my stories. So
it sounds like you're getting recognition. If that's sort of what I'm taking away from this, perhaps prematurely, but you didn't get any of that in the UK. No one gave a damn about what you'd done, more or less. And now you're in this environment where people were really receptive to hearing and wanting to gain from your knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, I think recognition, I'm not sure recognition is the right word, because it wasn't an ego. It was more to do with almost therapy. It's like needing to talk things through.
Right.
And so teaching, when you've actually got to teach and you can talk and you can learn, that is very therapeutic.
So was this a way that you could come to terms with your own experience?
Yes. In Iraq, during that year of the surge, we had 1,000 soldiers die that year. So you come up with a plan, and then people go and implement that plan, and 1,000 people died. You think, what did they die for? What was it all for? How can you give meaning to that? And you can give meaning to it by talking about what they did, how they lived, what sort of people that they were. And so teaching and then writing became a way of processing this and giving meaning to the effort, to the lives, to the whole endeavor. Because if we can learn something from that experience, if others who come after us can learn something from that experience, then that was worth living. So even though it has been a disaster, if people can learn from it and it helps them do things differently, then that's something invaluable to pass on.
Yes. And it's the little that we can do to give their lives that could have been so full and were cut short a little more meaning than they might otherwise have had.
In my book, in the Unravelling, I write about them as if they're all still alive. I write about how they lived. And you can go through the book and you think, that person's dead, that person committed suicide afterwards, that person had a breakdown. But in the book, they are as they were, as they lived. And that was important. So you remember people, you don't remember them when they grew old and decrepit. You remember them when they were living life, doing something that they thought was important.
Yeah, you were capturing their spirit.
Yes.
Sounds like.
So I feel that was my role really from the war. It wasn't so much about what I did during the war. It became more of explaining the war to people, teaching about it, and helping the next generation. And so now this book is studied in the war colleges. People read, people like you. I've never come across you, if it wasn't through the book.
Some rando gives you an email saying, I read your book, it's great. Can I talk?
Yeah, these things, legacies are passed on in different ways. So we can learn from each other, we pass on, because it is about improving things for the next generation. The world's a big place and it's a big universe, and we're here a little speck of time. And what can you do to leave things a little bit better for the next lot?
Yeah.
How can you help those who come after you have some tools and instruments to live their life?
Yeah. I think before we move on, as difficult as it is for me, what you were saying about, remembering people who have, through telling their stories, that's just something that is so powerful and deep and personal to me. And I, in some ways don't want to talk about it, but in other ways, that's exactly the thing that, my brother John passed away so far before his time. And one of the reasons why I'm passionate about trying to at least spread my message of, which hopefully some people might hear and then want to do just that little bit more with their life and make their life just that little bit more meaningful and better. If I can tell John in that story, then that is that tiny little thing I can do to make that meaningless, pointless death that little bit more impactful, that, John's legacy can live on. And it sounds like that's something that also speaks to you.
It absolutely does. I mean, you look at the people who die before their time. And when you get to live, you're not only living your life, you're living their life as well. And it makes you feel you got to fill it every day that you can to the full amount, because you don't know when your time is up. But to try and live each day as fully as you can, to be as good a person as you can, to contribute as much as you can, that is something. And you know that they're up there somewhere looking down on you and like cheering you on. And I think of all the people that I met whose lives were taken early, that they contributed to who I am. And now through writing and teaching, I'm contributing to others. And so the legacy goes on. It's part of that long line. And it does go on.
It sounds like you really believe in that not only the world has the capacity to become a better place, but that it is becoming a better place. And that, sometimes it can feel very difficult to see that. But there are books like Factfulness that came out quite recently, says actually there has been real development, and progress has been made, and I know that's kind of your current direction. But in from 2010 and then particularly in 2014, the situation in Iraq just got worse and worse, and in 2014 the Islamic State spread very rapidly across Iraq and Syria. A huge amount of your work and other people's work and lives and money and time, American, British, but most of all Iraqi, were lost. How did it make you feel? All this huge amount of time that you put in and so much meaning that you'd gained from this activity, and then to see it, in your words, unravel.
Yeah, well, I kept going back to Iraq. I mean, when I left my job, it was in 2010, but then I'd go back, twice a year, because I felt so involved. I cared so much. I was forever going back to see Iraqis, traveling around the country, trying to get a sense of what was happening. And, the American policy was just to give this support for the prime minister, even though he lost the election in 2010. And this prime minister had horrible policies that were driving people away from each other and pushing people towards ISIS. And watching this, you're like, this is going to end really, 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 really badly. And so it did. And it was just awful to watch. ISIS took over a third of Iraq, just like that, so easily. And, we'd spent so much time and money training the Iraqi security forces. Maliki had removed the good officers because he thought they were too close to the Americans, replaced them by people who were loyal to him. And they took the money that they were supposed to use to spend on weapons and food for the soldiers, ammunition and food for the soldiers. When ISIS came in, none of the officers told the soldiers to fight. And without officers, the soldiers just took off their uniforms and fled, and all their equipment was then taken over by ISIS. None of that needed to happen.
But it did happen. And I'm just really intrigued to how did that leave you feeling?
Really, really awful. And with the Arab Spring, there was this hope that, despite everything that had gone bad in Iraq, maybe something good was going to happen to the broader Middle East. And so I was following the Arab Spring. I was going, every square, every protest. I was there in Tahrir, I was there in Tunisia, following them. And then I went to Syria and watching Syria thinking, it's going to go like Iraq. It's going to break down into civil war. So all the hopes that came initially from the Arab Spring started to dissipate. You saw these young people, they were passionate, demanding dignity, demanding opportunities, demanding a future. But there was no organizational capacity to morph into political parties. So people were very good at saying what they didn't like. They weren't so good at coming up with alternatives that could attract a big support.
That's always the difficult bit, isn't it?
It's always the difficult bit. We can see it now as we come out of COVID, with all these protests gaining steam. That, is very difficult. You can go out and feel passionate, articulating your voice about what's wrong in the world. How do you then develop the right policies? How do you, get politicians on board? How do you get political agendas that might win elections to bring about real change? So it's not just about posting on social media.
Because they, it's seen as, social media was such a huge driver, and a really positive thing, back in 2011 as a, this amazing way of communication and organizing the protests, but was proved very effective for that. But as you say, it doesn't provide everything that's needed then to transition into a better form of governance.
And we have the same tools that you can use to mobilize people for good intent can also be used to mobilize for bad intent. Plus all the misinformation, the disinformation, all of this going on. So it's really, really hard to bring about systemic change. And I think, some people have got concerns what's happening in America now. It's going to go like the Arab Spring. Will it actually be able to bring about systemic change? This is really challenging because it's a problem of our whole economic system of capitalism, which really enables some people to get very, very, very wealthy. And it encourages human greed, or the incentives of a human greed, and doesn't put human well-being and the environment as the priorities. So do we have the wherewithal to think what sort of economic system could put human well-being, equality, environment at the center? Because really, when you look at the end of the day, what we have in common with each other far outweighs our differences. What humans want more than anything is community. You need a certain amount of money to fill your basic needs, but after that, you're not getting much more enjoyment from that money. So can we create this new society, a better society?
And so, talking about this desire to move towards a better governed world, and working together, I was wondering to what extent this has become your new purpose and direction. You're the director of the World Fellows Program at Yale University. You get the opportunity, I think it's something like 30 fellows in for 4 months at Yale each year from all around the world, all different backgrounds, but by all accounts, exceptional individuals. Do you see this as a way of, on one hand, I'm interested, a way of filling in the gaps that, say, social media didn't, in terms of the Arab Spring protests, as a form that might be a program that then leads to better governance? Or do you see this as something that just brings people from all parts of the world closer together, so we can all re-recognize, as we need to time and time again, that actually we are a lot more similar than we are different?
I think both of those things. I mean, I really do believe that individuals matter. Individuals can make a difference. we're working within structural constraints, but your individual, your character, your leadership skills, your ability to manage relationships, those really, really matter. And so as you say, I direct the World Fellows Program, of which Marvin Rees, the Mayor of Bristol, is a Yale World Fellow.
Yes, he is, yeah.
And we have thousands apply each year, and we bring together 16 people. And yes, these people come from, different countries, different backgrounds, different creeds, different colors, but also different disciplines. So you're putting people together. You've got some who work in civil society, some who are politicians, some who are lawyers, some, who are just in the media. And by spending time together every week, two of them will present on what it is they do professionally and how it contributes to the good society. That our goal is to build, is to build wherever we live, good societies, good communities. And that's what we show. So inclusive, not just of different race, ethnicity, nationality, but inclusive of different ways of thinking, different views. It's not just one view. People have got very different views. And diversity of thought, diversity of disciplines, diversity of backgrounds. We've all got different things to contribute from our life experiences, from the professions that we pursue, from our personalities. And so it is a world that it imagines a world that's a good society in which we are all there, flourishing, contributing our talents.
And that sounds like one of the most worthwhile objectives I can think of. But I want to sort of challenge it as well, of course, because why not? I, for a long time, was very interested in, say, doing a master's in international development. And, like, in very crude, simplified terms, sort of bringing, prosperity and helping, countries in the continent of Africa, in lesser developed areas of the world, and I was going to, do a master's, and I would be a pro at it at the end, of course, because, 1 year and a few essays makes you a pro. I was wondering to what extent you feel the term international development exists, is helpful or not, because in a sense what you did and the American and British and international forces did in Iraq was trying to bring about international development. And please challenge me or correct me if I'm wrong, but you could argue that the good society is trying to bring around a form of international development. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on sort of squaring up what you think international development is or could be or has been, and perhaps where the good society fits into that as well.
I think when you look at international development, it has been framed in a way of Westerners going to develop developing countries, third world countries, developing countries, global south. I think that framework is it is problematic. When you look over the past decade or so, millions upon millions of people have come out of poverty. And that's fantastic. But they're coming out of poverty due to policies, mostly in China, also in India, not because Western countries have developed these countries. So the good society is not about Westerners going to develop others. The idea of a good society is that everyone, wherever you live, you're trying to make your community a good community. You're contributing, and you might go and learn from others. You might share experiences with others, but you are doing it yourself in your community.
What would you say? What if I was lucky enough to have met you when I, read your book in 2016, 17, and I said, Emma, I'm thinking of doing a master's in international development, and to anyone in that sort of situation, one who and let's make it a bit broader, who wants to make a really positive impact in the world. And I think there's so many people who really genuinely want to do that. What would you say is the most effective way of doing that? And I guess we're talking perhaps more in a Western context, just that's unfortunately our predominant audience at this point. Hopefully we'll go more global in the future.
I would say to you, don't go and study international development. So I would advise that's not the most useful degree to do these days. You could look at getting into tech. You could look at social enterprises. But these are very different ways. If you want to work internationally, there are different ways of working internationally than joining an international development organization or a charity. There'll always be space for humanitarian organizations to respond to humanitarian disasters. But the traditional ways that, we do international development, we do log frames, we do all of these things, that era has gone. It's gone with, I think, the digital era, the information era. And I think you can do really interesting work as a social entrepreneur when you're doing things which are, helping social entrepreneurs in different countries, when you're bringing tech, when you are looking at different ways of doing things, when you're actually adding some value there, I think that could be useful. But always go into this with some humility. I think it's really good to work in your own country, learn things well at home, get involved in local government, get involved in politics here, because then through that experience, you might have some useful comparative experience to offer to others. Traditionally with international development, it's always, us coming up with technical solutions to what are inherently political problems and then wondering why they don't work.
Yeah.
So the world is changing, and we live in a different time. And to recognize that, you can't judge what the world was like 20 years ago with today's eyes. When you even think of the Iraq War, for someone of your generation, it's like the most ridiculous thing, but you can only understand it in the context of 9/11. It wouldn't have happened without 9/11. But in the context of 9/11, the fear the American president had of another attack, where might it come from? Saddam's a bad guy.
Yeah.
You can understand things in their context. Yeah. The world was very different 20 years ago. When I graduated, it was the end of the Cold War. And that was a period of huge optimism. Mandela was released from jail. The Middle East peace process began. There was a sense of all the problems of the world are going to be resolved. And I was like, yes, the one I'm going to work on is the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel-Palestine. That will be my thing. Yeah. And I did that for a decade. And then it was the Iraq War, and I did that. And the world's changed rapidly in that period.
I was wondering, as the penultimate part to this conversation, whether you said at the very beginning, the way that your life has panned out so far was not planned in the slightest. It has sort of just happened. But I was wondering if you could identify the one or two key pivot points where your life just suddenly went boom, off in a different direction, 90-degree turn.
After school, I took a gap year and I went to kibbutz in Israel. And that was an incredible experience. Still think of that as one of the happiest times of my life. Create this ideal society, people from all over the world, all different backgrounds would come and spend time together, working in the fields. I worked in the cowshed and discussing the meaning of life and how to bring about world peace in the evening. Yeah. And that just showed me that what we have in common is so much. And at 18, that was very influential. So that then led me to change. I was supposed to do classics and I changed to Middle East studies at Oxford. That was one. And the decision to go to Iraq in 2003. And people said to me, why on earth did you go to Iraq? And I thought, what a bizarre question. Why would you not go to Iraq?
Yes.
And yet for most people, they wouldn't go. For me, again, that was a life-changing decision. And despite everything, I'm still really pleased that I went. I think of the people I met, the friendships that I have. Iraqis have so enriched my life. And, I'm really pleased that an Iraqi translated the Unravelling into Arabic. And so I have all these Iraqi readers who reach out to me. Well, they're under, in lockdown for COVID. Some of them have been reading the Unravelling as their lockdown book, and they have book clubs to read it. So
cheery reading.
Yeah, and then they're contacting me over, Facebook to ask opinions on this or opinions on that. And my life today would be so different without Iraqis in it. It's been so greatly enriched by the Iraqi friends that I have made.
Yeah. I've got 3 final questions, and they're quick fire. So
the penultimate one.
Huh?
You said that was the penultimate question, and then there were 3 more.
I deliberately said I think I'll have to re-listen to this was the penultimate topic. What did I say? I tried to avoid the use of the word question because I realized I was going to ask 3 questions, so it didn't have quite the same ring to it. Sorry if I've misbranded this last section. Okay, 3 questions, quick fire, and just really what's off the top of your head. So where's the favorite place that you've been?
Oman.
Specific part or just the country?
Just the country. Fantastic, beautiful country.
Okay, great. What's your favorite piece of music?
Oh God. I can't think offhand, but I always had trouble running. And I thought when I was running, I was listening to news podcast. And a friend of mine said, put on some 80s music and go running with the 80s music and you'll find it much better. So that's why I just got back from running, listening to this 80s music.
Okay.
I'll leave it that broad.
Nice, yeah. That does me. I love a bit of 80s music. Okay, and final question. Favorite book?
I loved, when I was a student, I loved George Orwell. I really loved him. But as a kid at school, I loved Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. And I think Lord of the Rings has probably had more impact on me than any other book. I think I saw myself as a hobbit because I'm not particularly tall. But this idea of going out on big adventures, working hard against all odds to try and make things a little bit better. I think that book, and you can read it, and I've read it over and over again, you see different things in it at different ages. So I will go with Lord of the Rings.
Thank you, Emma. Emma, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for sharing your insights, your thoughts, your deep contextual understanding. It's a conversation I have massively enjoyed.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. Great talking to you.
No, thanks. Bye.